Good evening. My name is Leah Frieden, and I'd like to welcome you all to the Fayetteville Public Library, and welcome to those watching at home through live stream as well. Before you leave today, please take a moment to fill out the evaluations that we've left for you. Those help us to plan for future programs. And let me tell you a little bit more about our speaker this evening. Ed Levi began his beekeeping career in France, where he graduated from a college beekeeping program and kept bees there for 5 years. He continued in his beekeeping business in Arkansas and became the Apiary Specialist and Inspector for the Arkansas State Plant Board, where he served for 25 years. He is also an Eastern Apiculture Society Master Beekeeper. His teaching covers all levels of beekeeping and often involves integrated pest management in bees. During much of the last 20 years, Ed has volunteered as a consultant for USAID, teaching beekeeping in many developing countries in Asia, Africa, South America, and Eastern Europe, consulting on more than 40 assignments. In the spring of 2019, with the assistance of a grant, Ed organized and runs a queen breeding cooperative in Northwest Arkansas, where the goal is to develop queens with high levels of hygienic behavior. This co-op continues with this goal. He still maintains a few colonies in the Fayetteville area and is past president of the Northwest Arkansas Beekeeping Association. And as many of you know, Ed also worked with the library to set up a display area and a small apiary up here on the roof. And that's part of what we'll be talking about today. So please help me welcome Ed Levi.
You did make me sound better than I am. Good evening. I'm going to ask for a little bit of an excuse because I just got back from Madagascar 2 days ago. So I'm a little bit time zoned. I wanted to, for one thing, this video is only 7 minutes and 44 seconds. So it took you longer to get here than the video is. I want to start by thanking the library for letting me do this and for helping me to set up an apiary on the roof. The apiary is supported by and promoted by the Northwest Arkansas Beekeepers Association. And we're planning to enlarge it. In fact, I was talking to the facility people today about doing some more things there. We're going to get a grant to be able to put an observation hive, which is a glass hive inside the building where the bees fly through the wall, through a tube outside, and people can watch the bees inside the glass observation hive. And then any of you that have seen the display over there, there's sort of a artistic tree that the library put up, and it's got a hole in it. And so I've got a video of bees inside of a tree, so we're going to hopefully put in like a iPad type thing in the tree so people can come and look in the hole and see what the bees are doing. They're not really there. But there's a lot of books over there about bees, and I encourage you, if you're interested in bees at all, to look at some of the books, check out some of the books. Periodically I'll be working the bees on the roof, but I'm real bad at telling people when I'm going to be there. In fact, this video, I kept putting it off, and I'll explain why. So it was very hard for Leah to be able to tell people this is the day it's going to happen, that I'm going to be harvesting honey and extracting it down in the kitchen. And I'll explain why in a few minutes. But anyway, we've got a great library here, and I'm really proud to be able to work with them. I don't work for them, but I work with them on this project anyway. And I live basically across the street, so it's easy for me. Honeybees came about the same time as flowers appeared on Earth, which was necessary because flowers need bees and bees need flowers. It's a symbiotic relationship, And both of them rely on each other, in fact, to the extent that they cannot exist without each other. And so what ends up happening is there's a relationship between bees and flowers, that the flowers make themselves pretty and have colors and have shapes that the bees see with ultraviolet vision, that directs them to where the flower needs to be pollinated. And in exchange for that pollination, the flower gives nectar and pollen back to the bees. So the bees need that pollen and nectar in order for them to live, and the flowers need the bees in order for them to produce seed or fruit or whatever. And actually, the way I think of fruit, it's not for us. Just like the flowers are pretty for us, we think, but they're really just really trying to attract pollinators. And the fruit is food for the seeds that they're making. So when the fruit falls, the seed is nourished and then works its way into the soil and can grow. And so the whole relationship with bees and flowers and seeds and fruit and vegetables and everything is really a beautiful process. And it all happened about 30 million years ago. Before that, it was mainly grasses and non-flowering plants. And before that, there were no bees either. So there's about 4,000 different types of bees in North America. Honeybees is just one of them. And honeybees are not actually from North America. They were brought over by the Pilgrims. So honeybees are invasive, if you will, but they became very necessary, because as we changed from hunters and gatherers, which the other bees were able to pollinate enough of, and started doing more big crops, we were able to bring in colonies, and a colony can have 60 to 80,000 bees in it. We could bring a colony to a place that needed pollination. We could transport the bees onto monocultures and things like that. And the bees are very, what's the word? What's the word when a person stays with a partner? Monogamous. Thank you. I should know that word. I'm married. The bees are monogamous pretty much. They pretty much stick with one type of flower. So when they're going from flower to flower, they're doing a good job pollinating, which a lot of the other pollinators go from one flower to a different flower. And so that pollen is often wasted, whereas honeybees are monogamous, thank you, and they stay with the same species for a long time until that flower's done, and then they'll move on to another one. And sometimes you'll have like 3 hives in one apiary, a place where you have hives, and some of them will be going to one flower and some of the hives will be going to another flower. But so that's real important. And another thing that's important is that bees have hair on their body, and that hair has a static electric charge that the pollen sticks to. So in other presentations, I show that the bees have pollen all over themselves. And so when they move from flower to flower, they're inadvertently doing the pollination. Their main purpose is not to do the pollination. Their main purpose is to collect nectar and pollen. The nectar becomes honey, and that's a carbohydrate that they need for energy to be able to fly and also to feed to their brood, their babies. The pollen is absolutely necessary for the babies. It's the protein. And while collecting nectar and pollen for their needs, they're pollinating. And there's about 130 agricultural crops in America, in the US, that require or benefit largely from honeybee pollination. And so if we didn't have honeybees, as a friend of mine says, we'd be eating gruel. We'd be eating grains and things like that don't need pollination from bees. Some of them are pollinated by the wind and things like that. But beyond the 130 crops, there's also nature. And I worked one time in Bangladesh, and I was working with the Ministry of Forestry, and they were wanting to protect the tigers and I was there to protect the bees, and they weren't really interested in me, except I explained to them that the bees are pollinating flowers that the little animals are eating, that the tigers are eating. So we're protecting the tigers. So they welcomed me then. The value added from those agricultural products are worth about 50 times the value of the honey that the bees produce. So in the US, about $200 million worth of honey is produced, but about $14 billion of agricultural product is added because of the pollination that the bees do. And when I've taught in little schools, in schools with little kids and stuff, I've said, what do you think the bees don't help? And one kid said, ice cream. And I said, no, the bees help make ice cream because they pollinate alfalfa and clover that the cows eat to make rich milk to make ice cream with. So another kid said, water. And I said, okay, you got me. But it's important that beekeepers are sure not to take too much honey, because the bees are making honey for themselves. They're not making honey for us. And the trick that the beekeeper does is very much like a dairyman. If you have a cow, the cow makes milk for its calf. But we encourage the cows through breeding and feeding and et cetera, grooming and keeping healthy, to make too much milk. And beekeepers do the same thing with bees. We encourage them to make more honey than they need. In this part of the world, if we're able to get, say, 50 pounds of honey off of a colony, they probably produced about 400 pounds of honey, but they consumed the rest of it. And then in Madagascar, they say the cold season, during the winter, they have to live still. In fact, they need that energy to keep warm because they cluster into a little ball, and that ball has sort of an insulation of bees, and inside there's bees that are eating honey and then vibrating to create heat. And then that ball keeps rotating and the inside bees come out and the outside bees go in. And they don't heat a space like we do, like we would heat this room. They heat the cluster. So it's important for beekeepers, and this is one of the hardest things for beekeepers. And like Leah said, I've been keeping bees for 50 years and I'm always struggling with this. How much honey can you take? Because you have to leave honey for the winter. Some people are harvesting honey right now. I like to harvest it a little bit earlier, but am I that boring? It's hard to decide, you know, can I take a whole box of honey or how much should I leave? And I try to leave 50 pounds for the bees to go through the winter. They usually don't eat it all, but they use it to build up their colony at the end of the winter, because the colony gets smaller during the winter because the queen stops laying eggs, and then the colony grows in the spring and starts getting bigger because the queen's stimulated to laying more eggs. And so they need food to get through the winter, but then they really need it, like in this area in late February, early March, for the queen to really get going laying a lot of eggs. And so if I leave 50 pounds, which is maybe too much, it pays me back. So, so the work of the beekeeper is to encourage more honey and to make sure that they never are hungry. The worker bees themselves work themselves to death. So there's actually 3 different ages of bees if you look at how they work. There's nurse bees, which are the youngest ones. There's house bees, which are the ones that are converting nectar to honey and also guarding the colony from invaders like beekeepers, and doing a bunch of other jobs. And then the last third of their life, they become foragers. So only about a third of the colony is out flying and going to the flowers and coming back with nectar and pollen, and they also collect water for cooling the brood, and they collect propolis, which is a gluey substance that comes from nectar, pollen, and different saps of trees and plants. And it's a glue that they use to close cracks in their hive and keep things tight. And it's also a natural antibiotic, so it helps them control diseases. So there's a lot of things that the bees do, and they work themselves to death. The maximum that a bee lives, and we want them to live their maximum, the maximum they live is 42 days. That's a whole bee's life. But so there's lots of bees dying every day, but the queen's laying between 1,500 and 2,000 eggs a day if she's good. So there's bees hatching out 21 days after she lays the egg all the time. So there's that many bees dying all the time too. Yes?
How do they carry water?
How do they carry water? In their honey stomach. Like they have two stomachs, and they carry water to evaporate it in the hive. The brood area has to stay between 92 and 95 degrees all the time. So if it's hot outside, they bring in a lot of water, they sort of put it around in the hive, and then the bees make a pattern of air movement using their wings to evaporate it out. So they invented the first coolers or air conditioners.
They just carry a little tiny bit.
Oh yeah, yeah.
It's just so amazing.
Yeah, it really is. A honeybee in its life only makes 1/12 of a teaspoon of honey.
Well, how much, like, have they ever measured how much water they
No,
give
I
in
never
there?
had.
Yeah, I mean, can you notice it?
No, you don't really see
Okay,
it.
you
You can
can't
see
ever-
when they're evaporating it.
Yeah, when they're hot,
Yeah.
yeah.
And then when they're cool, they huddle around the brood when it's cool out to keep the temperature between 93 and 95 degrees.
You said a honeybee lives an average of 42 days?
If everything
What about
works
the
with
queen?
the queen can live up to 8 years, but the quality of what she does, of her egg laying, goes down during that time. Because when she hatches out, of course she's a virgin, she goes on a mating flight about 5 days after she hatches out, and she mates with between 12 and 17 drones, and she collects all the sperm and semen that she can for her entire life. So as she gets older, she starts running out. Well, when she runs out, honeybees are unusual in this. The males are unfertilized. They're called haploids. The females are fertilized, but most of them are undeveloped as far as their reproductive system, except for the queen. And that's because of a different diet that they're fed during their development.
Do you normally replace a queen after a certain number of years or what?
Yeah, most beekeepers replace them about every 3 years. I used to raise queens commercially, and I replaced all my queens every year because I was aiming to get certain genetic traits. And so the more I replaced them with the best queens, the best offspring of good queens, the faster I could develop the hygienic traits that I wanted. So I try to replace all my queens every year. And young queens don't swarm, and we won't get into all that because that's beekeeping 101. So that's another advantage of replacing queens, is to not have as many swarms get away from you. So beekeepers, when they're trying not to take too much honey, they're harvesting just the surplus honey. Some beekeepers say that they're robbing the honey, and I don't use that term because I get stung more. But I think it's an attitude thing. So I harvest the surplus. In their lifetime, like I said, one bee produces about 1/12 of a teaspoon. And bees visit about 2 million flowers, or actually make visits to 2 million flowers to make 1 pound of honey, and fly about 85,000 miles to make 1 pound of honey. So a quart jar is 3 pounds. So what is that? Do I have that? Yeah. So a quart jar represents 6 million flower visits, 255,000 miles, and the lives of 2,300 bees. So when I harvest honey, I'm very respectful, and when I extract honey, I'm very respectful. I don't want to lose a drop, because that's 12 bees' lives. And I think about that. When I put honey on my cereal, I think about it. You know, I'm thankful for it. So a quart jar is 6 million flower visits, 255,000 miles flown, and the lives of 2,300 bees. As you'll see in the video, I don't want to take too much honey, nor do I want to spill one drop. So I'm going to start the video. I'm going to stop it every once in a while so I can explain what's happening. But if anybody has any questions or comments or correcting my English or lack of vocabulary, I would appreciate it. So this happened in July, was it? I like to harvest honey when the bees are still making honey. And around here, July usually isn't a honey producing time. When they're still making honey, they don't pay attention to you very much when you're taking it away because they're busy. But when they're stopping making honey, then they're going to defend it more. The bees are out on the roof, and so we have to climb over a fence to get to them. And that the bottom box is called a brood chamber, and that's where the queen is laying eggs and the bees are developing. And then above that, they're called supers, the boxes that are superimposed or a superstructure or whatever you want to use super for, not Superman. But anyway, that's a super that's on the cart, and we're going to put that on the other side of the fence and then carry it around. Have all of you seen where the bees are over here? Is anybody not? Okay, if you walk through on this level, all the way to the back where the stairs go down into the new part of the building, before you go down the stairs, look over to your left and you'll see that bee tree and you'll see a bunch of books about bees, and there's smaller windows. There's the big windows like that, and then there's narrower windows, and those look right out to where the bees are. And if I'm ever out there working and you come by, come and watch and ask questions when I come in. You can't talk through the glass. But I have talked to people on telephones while I was working. This actually has music, but I asked him not to play it. This is Karen. She's an apprentice. She's just started beekeeping. And those are the 3 hives that we have out there. And a lady named Skylar that works here at the library painted them. This picture here is me lighting a smoker. Now, a smoker is something that beekeepers use, and the books used to say, and some of them still do, that the bees think that there's a fire, and when they think there's a fire, they go back into their house and they collect their valuables and get ready to evacuate. But I don't think bees think that. And what they do is they do eat honey, and it makes it harder for them to sting, but the main thing it's doing is it's covering up the alarm pheromone that bees tell each other there's a danger going on, and so we need to protect that danger, and therefore they need to sting me or whoever. And so the smoke is just covering up the smell of that pheromone. So I'm lighting the smoker from the bottom because the way the bellows work, the air goes in the bottom and then comes out the top. And if you light it at the top, you're going to be blowing flames on the bees. And bees without wings don't make much honey. So I like to put a lot of fuel on top of the fire in order to cool it off before it gets out. And I use the smoker as little as possible. Like I said, I just got back from Madagascar and they use it a lot. And they do not have African bees in Madagascar, even though it's just off the coast of Africa. They have a unique bee that I just am in the process of doing a research project on. So there I'm lighting the smoker and then putting the flame down at the bottom. I think I had trouble lighting that smoker, but the video people were very nice and cut out the trouble. So a little bit of puff in the door to let them know that I'm coming. It's sort of polite, like knocking on a door before you go in. And then taking off the lid, the inner cover, some bees on it. You can see the bees are very gentle. Now I'm taking out, I just wanted to remove 3 frames of each hive, and then I removed 9 frames from my house also, and we extracted all 18 frames down in the kitchen. That frame there is an iffy frame. You can see the white on it. That's, let me stop it for a minute. There it is. The white on it is a capping, and the bees will cover the honey when it's mature. Now when the nectar comes in, it comes in at almost 30% moisture. So the bees need to get that moisture out, and they also need to put enzymes into it to make it change from nectar to honey. So when it's mature, it's like capping a bottle or putting a top on a barrel. And you can think of all those cells as little barrels laying on top of each other. And you can see the top part of this is capped. The bottom part isn't, which means it's not quite mature. But it was thick enough that I thought I could take it. And what you want is at least 70 to 75% of the cells capped. And this one's a little bit under capped, but there was enough other ones to make up for the difference. In fact, the honey, and you'll see a picture of it, I tested the honey to see the moisture content, and it was as dry as any honey I've ever seen. So it was 15.5%. So there I'm just sweeping all the bees off more carefully than I do normally, because I had to walk through the library with the super, and I didn't want to let bees go in the library. It would bother people that were studying and stuff.
Do you ever wear gloves?
I rarely wear gloves. I find that if you wear gloves, you're not as careful, and so you squash bees. When you squash bees, you're releasing that alarm pheromone, plus you're killing bees. Now there's a frame that's totally capped, so you can see that that's going to be a good dry one. As you can see, I don't even have the veil over my face. The veil's tucked down under my chin, but it's like a convertible. If it starts raining, I pull it up. So we're putting them in that box to be real careful not to have bees in it, and then taking them out of the super. So I just wanted to take 3 frames from each hive, hoping that there's 9 frames in the supers, hoping the other 6 frames will have enough honey for the winter, and that maybe they'll fill up those 3, because we're going to replace them. So here we're in the kitchen. I don't normally move that fast. We're in the kitchen. That's Karen again with me. That's an extractor that's in the foreground. And then where I'm leaning over is an uncapping tank. And I'm going to be taking the frames and cutting those cappings off so that we can put it in the extractor, which is basically a centrifuge. And it throws the honey against the inside of the barrel, and then the honey runs down to the spigot. So it's a pretty neat process. This extractor is a little bit off balance. When I had a business, I sold my business, but I had bigger extractors, and the bigger they are, the less they get off balance. But you'll see this one's going to get off balance a little bit. I really am moving fast. So plugging in the extractor and then getting the knife. The knife is also heated because it makes it a lot easier to cut the wax off. Getting the barrels off and the filter ready, and getting ready to cut the first one. I cut from the bottom up because it falls off easier that way. When I do a lot of it, I usually put duct tape on my hand because I'm going to cut myself, and this way I'm putting the Band-Aid on beforehand. So the cells, if you look at a frame up close, the cells are all slightly slanted upward. And that's because they're bringing in the nectar wet. If they were level or facing the other way, it would run back out. So the bees are really smart, and those cells are amazing. They're perfect little hexagons, 6-sided with a back, and the back of the cell on this side is not matching the back on this one. They overlap each other to make them stronger. And computer programs cannot figure out how to use less material for such a strong thing. that frame will be holding 3 pounds of honey and hardly any wax in it. So and if you look at Dodge trucks and things like that, they all have hexagons. I see hexagons everywhere I go. People are starting to learn from the bees. So the knife is warm, and I unplug it in between because I don't want it to get too hot. It is adjustable, and it's fairly sharp. And you can see my thumb up there acting like a victim. So there I am cutting, and I usually just cut straight with the wood, and then I'm able to give the frame with the cells back to the bees. For the bees to build that beeswax, they produce the wax themselves from the energy that they get from flowers. But to build 1 pound of beeswax takes energy that would produce 8 pounds of honey. So that wax is very valuable. And we're putting those in. Let me go back to that. We're putting those in with the top towards the outside because of the way the cells are that way. So when it spins, it comes out both sides. The old extractors were tangent, which meant that they were like this, and then you went slow the first time and extracted one side, stopped and turned it around, extracted the second side faster, and then turned the first side back around to do it. So it was a lot more work, and you couldn't get as many frames in an extractor that way. Her hands are a lot nicer looking than mine. So this is just, these frames are pretty nice looking. I like it when they're totally capped like that. I just got an invitation to go to Kyrgyzstan recently, and they sent me a video to show what good beekeepers they were, and they were extracting brood. That frame, I'm going to show you that for a second. See how there's sort of a darker area in the middle of that frame? That frame had some brood in it at some time. I use queen excluders so that the queen can't get above the brood chamber, but that frame has some brood in it, and every time a larva metamorphosizes into a pupa, they spin a little cocoon inside the cell, and so the cells get darker and darker and tougher. The white cells are much easier to uncap. This is Karen's first time to do this, so she was learning. She was going to be here tonight to help on this, but it's her birthday. So there's the centrifuge going, and it goes quite fast. Most of the centrifuges are adjustable, so you start slow and get some of the weight out of it. There it is off balance. And that's because those dark frames got put too close together instead of across from each other. And there's lots of 1/12 of a teaspoons. It's amazing how much honey comes out of those things. And you can see there's a lot of air in there. There's a little bit of impurities, a little bit of wax. So this filter is a double stainless steel filter. It's got a large mesh on the top and then finer below. That's called a refractometer. Let me see if I can get to where it is. You ask if I wear gloves, you can see that I don't, just because my hands are puffy and spotted. I do get bee stung quite often. Okay, so that's all right. It's called a refractometer. And what it does is it measures, and I wish we had gotten a shot inside of it, it measures the moisture content. So what we got out of this first extraction was 16%, and the second extraction we got 15.5% moisture, which 20% is passable. Most honey is sold at 18% on, if it's packed by commercial packers. What you get from small beekeepers can be anything, especially in places where they're really hungry and want to get honey fast. That really looked easy, didn't it? There you can see the thermostat area of the knife. Any questions so far? The first extractor I extracted in the kitchen of a 400-year-old house that I lived in France. And two of us would get on top of the extractor trying to hold it down, and it would still bounce around the room. They were just getting the last of the honey out of the extractor, and that's the uncapping tank. And we actually got almost a half a bucket, which is about 30 pounds. Bucket holds 60 pounds. We almost got a half a bucket out of the uncapping, out of the cappings. So we let those drip quite a while. This picture here, we're bottling the honey, and we're doing it on the side of a jar, sort of like beer. If you pour beer into the bottom, it's going to foam up and overflow. Honey doesn't overflow, but it does bring more air into it when you go directly, so I do it on the side of the jar. Normally when I'm extracting a lot of honey, I have large stainless steel tanks that I call settling tanks. This is a settling bucket because we were doing a small amount, and we only filled this jar for display for the video. Normally I let it sit for about 3 days, and any air goes to the top, and any impurities like wings or pieces of wax and stuff all float to the top. And the water floats to the top too. So you can actually skim off a little bit of extra moisture that way, because honey is quite a bit heavier than water. A quart of water would weigh 2 pounds. Is that right? No. Is that right? 8 pounds to the gallon. So it'd be 2 pounds a quart. A quart of honey is just an ounce under 3 pounds. So it's quite a bit heavier, so the water will come up. Yes?
So you cut off the caps, and they're there in the uncapping tub. What happens to that wax? Do you do something with that, or does it?
Yeah, I melt that, and
Okay.
and I use a lot of it to repaint frames to give the bees a start on a new frame. I used to have a candle business. Some people make lotions and creams and soaps and things like that. And I teach that overseas a lot of times because they're looking for value-added products, different ways they can make some money. Any other questions right now? Because we're getting towards the end of this video.
So you brush it on? Like you melt the wax and brush it on the frame?
Yeah, the foundation, this is getting someplace where I don't like to go. The foundation is usually made out of beeswax, but a lot of commercial beekeepers who are selling the most amount of beeswax are using a lot of acaricides, insecticides for spiders, because the mites are a parasite on bees. So they're trying to kill the mites with acaricides, and those acaricides have emulsifiers in them that the wax absorbs, because wax is a fatty tissue. And so it's hard to get the insecticides out of the wax. And so when we started having the parasites back in the 80s, I stopped buying wax. And now I get food-grade plastic foundation, and you can get it with sprayed-on wax, but I don't want that wax, so I get it naked, and then I paint it with beeswax. And the bees pull it pretty quick.
So you don't have to use anything on your bees?
No, I haven't used anything for 20 years. I used to teach how to use the acaricides, and then I started finding out that they're sublethal to the bees, and they're dangerous for the beekeepers too.
Because you didn't used to have to, right?
No.
Okay, 'cause you used to
No, you used to just have a tap on the hive and fill up the jars. No, it used to be much easier. No, in the 80s we got 2 different mites.
Oh, that was in the 80s, okay.
Yeah.
I didn't know when they came.
Yeah, the Verona Mites, which are the ones that we still are fighting and are causing lots of problems, came to the States in '86. They came to Brazil. Excuse me, I'm confusing something else. They came to the States in '86. They originally came from Asia. They were on a different honeybee, the Apis cerana. Our bees are called Apis mellifera. And some beekeepers from Ukraine, from the Lviv area that we see in the news quite a bit now, that I've been with those beekeepers, had sent a bunch of bees to the far east of Russia because there was a great acacia forest there that made lots of honey. So they put them on trains and they went there, and it was right next to China, which is where the Apis cerana was, and the Verona Mites jumped from the Apis cerana onto Apis mellifera. The Ukrainians brought them back to Europe. I had Verona Mites in 1977, and they got to the States in '86. And they're all over the place. Where I just came from working in Madagascar, they got there in 2010, the area I work in. They got there in 2012, and I worked with a cooperative the last couple weeks that are totally inundated. They're going to lose their bees if they don't do something quick. So I gave them a step-by-step, this is what you need to do. The caricides are life-saving. For a short period of time, the mites become resistant to them. And then also the bees suffer from them. And so I have been working for 17 years of trying to create this hygienic behavior of bees that can detect where the mites are reproducing and basically throw them out. There's several different modes of control that the bees will use, but nature's pretty amazing. If for example, I came from Madagascar 2 days ago, and I have a disease that none of you have ever seen, sort of like smallpox with the Native Americans. Blankets, was it smallpox? Or, yeah. They'd never seen it, and so they died from it. And that happened with the beetles, the mites. So the bees were dying from it. Well, that's not good for the mites or the bees. So nature sort of finds a balance, but it's a very long process. So in breeding for these traits that they use, because there's several different traits, breeding for these traits that they use, you can speed up that process that they would do it naturally. But if people are using insecticides, that's taking away the ability of the bees to learn to take care of themselves. I know the first time I had a tick and I got tick fever, I was in France, and pharmacists in France are somewhere in between pharmacists here and doctors. And so you go to the pharmacist to find out what you need, and he'll give it to you, and he'll talk to you about it and explain. And the pharmacist told me, I could give you medicine to get over this tick fever you have. If you don't take any, you have a small chance of dying. But if you don't take any, you probably won't have trouble next time. So that's sort of the same idea. In Madagascar, where I just was, the people have been using an acaricide in a bulk form that creates resistance in the mites almost instantly because it gets absorbed in the wax and in the woodware and everything. And the mites are exposed to small doses over long periods of time. So the first acaricide that we had was 98% effective in the beginning. But those 2 mites that survived out of 100, their offspring were resistant, and that keeps multiplying and multiplying until it got down into the 40s, and then it wasn't worth using. So we had to come up with another one, and then the same thing happens. Any other questions right now? I think we're just about at the end. That's not what I want to press. So I did let this settling bucket settle for a few days and came back and filled more jars for the library. I took half of them because half of them were from my house. But that jar would be a lot clearer if it had settled. It had a lot of air in it. But the honey ended up being really pretty. The Northwest Arkansas beekeepers had a picnic Sunday that I visited for 2 minutes, but I was cross-eyed. And they had in that picnic they had a honey tasting and refractometer, moisture level, and also something else that I made is called a polariscope, where you have polarized filters going both directions, and you put the honey in between and shine a light through it, and you can see all the impurities. You can have a beautiful jar of honey and put it in there and say, it's not that pretty. So they had a honey tasting contest, and I sort of wish I had a jar from here to enter it. It would have been interesting, because I think we could have won. But they did have good honey. So any questions? I'm sorry that I'm monotoned and
What honeybees are so important, and they say they're going to disappear if we don't do something. But what's the government doing? Are they giving grants to a lot of people to raise bees or what?
they have done that to some extent, but they haven't ever done enough. In my opinion, when we got Africanized bees in Arkansas, we got them in the southwest part of Arkansas, coming from Texas mainly. I was working for the plant board at the time, and I was in charge of the Africanized bee program. We put together an interagency task force, and I went to the governor's breakfast and gave a presentation about what was happening with the Africanized bees, and they all said it was the best presentation they'd ever had at the governor's breakfast, and didn't give me a dime. And you know, the budget was just, it was busting us, because we were inspecting a lot of bees down there. We were using most of our budget for inspecting things for Africanized bees. So we have several semi-trucks of 440 colonies to go to California every year. Well, California during the almond season is a big mixing pot of genetics and diseases and parasites and everything. So when they come back, they all have to be inspected. And 16 semi-trucks is a lot of bees. And we had to inspect them 3 times, because it takes a while for the genetics to get through the bees. When a truck goes to California, about 10% of the queens die. Well, the bees will make new queens, but they're going to breed there. And who are they breeding with? We don't know. So we were checking them all the time. So yeah, the government, and I worked for the government. I worked for the plant board, which is mainly controlling pests and fertilizers and things like that. I was the beneficial insect guy, but I was a stepchild. But you're right, bees are important. Einstein was supposed to have said that if we lose bees, we won't last 5 years.
Why are we busing so many bees to California? I didn't know that was a thing.
Because California produces 80% of the world's almonds, and almonds flower in February, and so there isn't anything else to pollinate them. So bees go from Maine and Florida and everywhere to go to California. 2/3 of the bees in the United States go to California for the almond pollination. And there's a lot of beekeepers that make their money doing that instead of honey. I don't know what the prices are now, but when I retired 11 years ago, they were getting $300 per hive for about 4 to 5 weeks. And they were carrying 440 colonies on a truck. So, and some of our beekeepers were carrying 6 trucks. They were making literally millions of dollars. And then they went from the almonds, they'd go up into the cherries and the apples and stuff like that. They'd make a big circuit. And so there's beekeepers, I call them wranglers, bee wranglers, that are just moving bees around.
So are they all having to use those chemicals on their bees?
Most of them are.
That's what I figured, yeah.
Yeah.
So how does that affect the whole thing?
How does it affect what?
Like all the bees being there and. like
It's
you said,
hard on it.
like-
I wouldn't do that to my bees. I mean, I'm not that hungry.
Yeah.
You say that,
Go ahead, sorry.
No, I was gonna say, like, would you say that using insecticides is the biggest issue in the beekeeping community? Are there other kind of issues, especially when you look at commercial beekeeping?
Yeah. Yeah, I don't like to talk about this publicly, really. Yeah, there's a whole bunch of problems in the beekeeping industry. The colony collapse disorder that was big in the news for a long time about basically 2/3 of the bees were dying every year. And if that happened in cattle, you know, we'd be scared. But bees, people don't think about it much. But it was basically a perfect storm. It was partly management of the bees and how they were being treated. Just taking them on the pollination circuit is not what bees would not naturally do. And so, you know, the beekeepers in North Carolina or in North Dakota would bring their bees to Texas, southern Texas, to build them up in the wintertime to take them to California. Well, bees up in North Dakota normally have a long winter to rest, but they lost that. And so that's a management problem. And then having, you know, there's a couple beekeepers that have over 50,000 colonies. And so it's a factory. And even in Arkansas, we have beekeepers that have 12,000 colonies. And some of them admit that they're not really beekeepers, that they're honey wranglers or bee wranglers. So that's part of the problem. Global warming is a big problem. Monocultures is a huge problem. Urban sprawl is a big problem. So there's a whole bunch of problems that happened all at once, and people tried to find out what was causing the colony collapse disorder, and it's really just a combination. It's just a perfect storm. Just a bunch of things happening at once. Monocultures, you know, they need bees in a monoculture, but they spray a lot because when you have a monoculture, you're going to have pests. And also the bees are going to be eating one thing. You know, so they get one kind of pollen and one kind of nectar, and that's what they're living on. You know, for you, yogurt might be good, but if you ate nothing but yogurt, for one thing, you'd get cataracts. And for another thing, you just wouldn't be healthy. So bees need a round diet, and we do too. Yes, ma'am.
What made you originally interested in beekeeping? I know that's kind of a big question.
Yeah, it is kind of a big question. Well, originally, when I was a little boy, my older brother had a friend, and his dad was a lawyer who had an observation hive in his house. And when I went with my brother to his friend's house, I'd just sit there and watch the observation hive. But when I moved to France, I did not think about having to have a green card, and I just bought this place and moved in, and then somebody told me that you have to have a permit to live here or become a citizen. And I said, well, what do I need to do? And he said, well, given where you live, you can be a rock mason, a goat herder, or a beekeeper. Yeah, what would you choose? And so I said I'd be a beekeeper, and a friend of his, and this guy ended up being my best friend, but a friend of his, it was a professor at a university in the south of France, and they paid me a stipend to go to school to learn beekeeping. France has it's sort of like a hand-me-down of the old guild system, you know, the silversmiths. Those were people that were apprenticed by silversmiths, you know, experts that taught them how to be a silversmith. And France does that on everything. You know, if you want to build buildings, you go to a building school, and France wants you to, and they'll pay you to go. If you want to do the beams. There's a a beam, I almost said it in French, a beam school. There's welding schools. You know, it's sort of like our tech schools, but they expect everybody to do it. And I already had a degree, but they sent me to college again. Yes.
What's your next trip?
I don't know. I'm just trying to recuperate from this one and waiting for my luggage to get here. Yeah, they promised me it will come tonight. I'm going on a car trip tomorrow morning to North Carolina. But I've been asked to go to Kyrgyzstan, but there's a bunch of Russian draft dodgers in Kyrgyzstan right now, and I don't trust Putin, so I'm not going.
How's the war in Ukraine affecting all the beekeeping?
I don't know. You know, the Ukrainians are pretty amazing people, and they seem to be carrying on their lives even with this recent bombing. They're going in the shelter for a half an hour, and then they're coming out and playing checkers in the square. I don't know how it affected the beekeeping. Where I was, they had 2 huge cyclones in a short period of time earlier this year, and the beekeepers are just, you know, that's what happened, and we'll get over it. And they just keep going. You know, we're sort of spoiled in this country. We don't have the problems that a lot of poor countries have. And when we do have a problem, we think it's bigger than it is when you think about the problems other people have. You know, if we lose somebody in our family, we're devastated. There's people that there's only one person left in the family. Yeah.
At the beginning, you said that a beekeeper will try and encourage like production of more honey. What exactly does that look like? Do you tend to, hey, do a good job?
Yeah, this is what I teach a lot when I'm in other places. For example, in Madagascar, where I just came from, their favored honey, the one that sells the best, is lychee honey. And it's very good, and it's very light colored. And they don't make a whole bunch of it. And the reason they don't make a whole bunch of it is because they don't stimulate the bees in advance of it. So what's happening is it's after their cold period or their winter. It gets down to 43 degrees. And the bees are coming out of their smallest population and starting to build up. Well, they're using the lychee nectar to build on. So if they stimulated the bees through some frame manipulations and some feeding earlier, and when I say earlier, it's 6 to 7 weeks in advance, stimulate the queen to start laying eggs then. It takes 3 weeks for those eggs to become adults, and then it takes about 3 to 4 weeks for those adults to be foragers. So you stimulate them 6 to 7 weeks in advance, and you make honey on the beginning of the lychee flower instead of making bees on it. So that's basically, when I go to a country, I ask them to give me a chart with months of what flowers the bees are working, what flowers are favored, how much honey do they make. And I usually am able to say, okay, this flower isn't a favorite honey, so let's take less of that and leave more in the hive of that and stimulate the bees before this other flower.
If somebody is a baby bee interested person, like not a beekeeper, like but is interested in maybe dipping their toes into it, where do you tell them to start?
Join the association.
Okay.
It's a bunch of beekeepers. A lot of them are brand new, just like Karen in the video. A lot of them are just starting to learn, and we have a mentorship program. So anybody that's interested to learn, you join the association, $15 a year. This year we gave all the new mentors 2 colonies of bees for free. And they had to buy their own hives, but the colonies came in little boxes. And then they get a mentor, and they either go to the mentor's house or the mentor goes to your house, And when there's questions, there's telephone calls. I get texts all the time. I don't directly have any apprentices, but there's about a half a dozen of them that call me all the time. So it's a pretty neat program.
That's great.
Yeah, we used to do it just for kids, and but kids, what I say is, especially boys, they get overtaken by fumes, car fumes and perfumes. So they disappear.
Grown men last longer?
Yeah, grown men last longer. And I encourage women beekeepers. Women beekeepers are good, and especially when it comes to queen breeding, because it's some really fine work, because we're actually grafting 12-hour-old larvas into special cells. And women can do that better than men. And young people can do it better because their eyes are better. I wear magnifying glasses when I do it with a lamp.
So you were talking about like setting up a like what kind of space requirement would there be? Like, is this something you could do like in your backyard in the middle of town, or?
Yeah, in Fayetteville, there's a 2-hive limit for a normal lot, and there's rules on fences and how close you can be to the property line. But yeah, bees don't pay any attention to your property lines. They don't really pay attention to fences.
Yeah.
But if you have sort of a solid fence and you have a neighbor over here and the bees are here, they'll fly up, and they're not going to fly down to fly on. They're going to stay up high, so they'll go over the neighbor's house. And I've found that if you give the neighbor honey, they don't mind.
Can you repeat the statistics about what it takes to make honey? Like it was like the miles and the
different honeys.
Yeah.
The different honeys. Mostly it depends on the flower. You know, some honeys, like buckwheat, is very dark. Black locust is very white, almost like water. The flavors are very different. And so it depends on the flowers, but it also depends on the soil. So you can have the same flower in one place, and it will be different than another place. In Madagascar, they have a cassia that's being planted big right now because of the cyclones, and it's producing too much pollen. And so the bees are crowding out the queen with pollen. And I'm not sure the acacia is, I think of black locust as being acacia. And there's honey locust too that doesn't make as much honey as black locust. But I don't know if anybody knows what acacia is. Anybody? No? So yeah, different flowers. You know, clovers will make one honey, and orange blossom will make another. And some people know their preferences. Most beekeepers here don't try to have a specific flower. Basically, they'll say it's mostly something, or it's a polyflower, I guess. Multiflower, I don't know how to say it in English. But in France, they were very specific. So I had smaller supers that were short so that I could get specific honeys, because they could fill up a super faster. And then I'd take it off, and then I'd get the next honey. And they didn't want, you know, light honey or dark honey. They wanted specific flower. French are that way.
You talked about how many miles goes into each quart and how many lives of each bee. Can you repeat those? I think there were 3 of those numbers. Can you repeat those?
Yeah, they take 85,000 miles to make a pound of honey. They fly about, I think I wrote these down on the plane. 1/12 of a teaspoon in their lifetime. 6 million, 2 million flowers for a pound, and 2,300 bees' lives for for a quart.
ACIA?
Acacia, you mean?
Yeah.
ACIA.
What is it?
ACIA, I think. I'm a creative speller, so I don't know.
Is that, you know what we're talking about in Russia, they have those?
No, they have it everywhere. I mean, there's acacia a lot of places.
Oh, okay, but it's different species.
Yeah,
Oh, okay, that's what I was wondering, but it's not the same one.
it's not what I think of as
Africa.
acacia. Because they were saying that it only grows like this high in Madagascar. And our acacia trees are enormous. There's some right next to my house.
But does the honey, it tastes different from all the varieties, doesn't it?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Like, do you have a favorite that you taste?
Well,
Favorite occasion?
Yeah, black locust is wonderful honey, but it flowers usually around the 1st of May, and it rains usually around the 1st of May. And so in France, I learned that if you pick the flowers, you know what black locust flowers look like? They're that white hanging grapes. Yeah. Don't tell everybody. But if you pick the flowers and put them in light pancake batter and fry them in just a little bit of oil and then put honey or powdered sugar on them, they're delicious. I learned that in France.
That does sound good.
Yeah, but don't take them all.
Yeah. Like I couldn't.
Well, we need them for the bees. So I think, were we supposed to be done at 7? I can go on.
Not hearing any more questions, so let's go ahead and give Ed another round of applause.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for your time.
Oh, no problem.